1 Corinthians chapter 9, let's start in verse 24. Paul says, and he asks this question. He says, don't you realize that in a race, everybody runs, but only one person gets the prize? And so in other words, now we talked about this a couple weeks ago that, in my day, this is absolutely true. In today's culture, everybody gets a prize. Okay, everybody's a winner today, all right? In Paul's day, that wasn't the truth because the only person who got a prize was the person who wins. So Paul, he tells us, if you're in this race, you need to do what? Run to how? Win. Run to win. And so in other words, Paul is saying, look, life is just like a race. And in a race, there's a beginning, there's a starting time, and there's definitely a finish line. Hello? Okay. And so through the race, we see that there's all kinds of challenges that can come our way whenever we race. There's obstacles that exist. There's uphills, there's downhills, there's corners, there's difficult terrain that we have to navigate. There's various weather conditions that make it easier or more difficult. Things just make racing difficult, okay? So Paul asks this question to us, a kind of a rhetorical question. He says, don't you realize that's what racing is all about? It's about those things. That's what makes it a race. To find ways to overcome those challenges is what sets the winners apart from the losers, because every racer is enduring the same thing. But there's only one champion at the end of the race, and that's the one who navigated all of those difficulties better than all the other racers. So Paul says, run to win. Run to win. In essence, what Paul is saying, that's what life is all about. Hardship, difficulties, difficult terrain, challenges that you never saw coming, challenges in your course of life that affect every person a little bit different. And he says, if you're going to be a winner in this life, if you are going to be a champion in this life, then you need to learn to navigate all of those difficulties. And then he goes on and he says this. He says, all athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for what? An eternal prize. Now, last week we talked about how all athletes, how they endure some level of pain. I mean, in the process of their training for whatever sport it's in, there is a level of pain. There's a level of just achiness in your muscles and in your joints. Some people have to develop blisters, and there's just heartache, and there's just days they go, okay? Every athlete, every sport, no matter what it is that you encounter, every athlete endures pain. But what separates the winners from everybody else is the ability to overcome pain. We talked about that a little bit last week, about how some of us, we have a tendency to hold on to our pain, and as a result, we don't want to move forward because the pain is preventing us. But yet, Paul says that eternal prize that we're after, we need to set it in our mind in such a way that that eternal prize is far better than any pain that we will have here on this earth. So Paul goes on to describe his own life a little bit. And here's what he says. And this part we're going to focus on today. He says, when it comes to all that stuff, he says, I have chosen to run with what? Purpose in every step. I'm not just shadow boxing. Okay, now, what Paul is really saying here is he's saying, look, because life is difficult, because there's so many challenges, because there's all this stuff that gets in my way, I have just chosen to be super intentional about everything that I do. I'm not going to waste any opportunities. I'm going to ensure that every step that I take has purpose and meaning in my future. And then Paul brings in this, instead of talking about racing, now he's going to talk about boxing. Now, do we got any boxing fans in here today? Okay, a couple of you, some of you are like, is it okay to be a boxing fan in church? Okay, it's okay. It's okay. All right. Now, for those of you that don't know the term, shadow boxing is actually the process that a fighter goes through, kind of how they're fighting the air, kind of going through the motions. That's called shadow boxing. Okay. And it's to make the motions of an attack or even a defense. Okay. So this is what boxers do as they stand in the corner. Okay. This is what your MMA fighters do when they're standing in the corner and they're just kind of going through the motions and they're staring each other down, just doing their thing. Okay. Like, I'm going to rip your head off. Okay. That's what they do. And so Paul is using this illustration. He says, in fact, some of your translations actually say that Paul, instead of using the word shadow boxing, he says, I'm not fighting in the air. Okay. So what Paul is saying is he's saying, I'm not just beating the air. Instead, everything I do is going to have a purpose. That if I'm going to go through the motion of a punch, I'm going to land a punch. Okay, you tracking that? He's not going to waste time. He's not going to waste energy. He is going to do everything he can with great intention. And then he says this in verse 26. He says, verse 27. He says, so then what I'm doing is I'm choosing to discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. I want you to think about that for just a minute. Paul says, I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it. Let's try this all together, okay? Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. What it should do. Okay, what it should do. Okay? Now, you may not know this, but there's a big difference between what you want to do and what you should do. How many of you discovered that to be true? Okay. Paul is using this illustration. He's saying, look, he says athletes, they have to train themselves. They have to train their body to do what it should. Because the reality of it is that there's a lot of athletes who'd rather stay home instead of go work out. That's kind of me right now, this phase of my life. Okay? Athletes would rather eat ice cream than celery. Now, if you're a celery lover like my wife, not criticism here. I'm just telling you there's something wrong with that if you like celery over ice cream. Okay? Athletes would rather go on vacation than go to practice. When the muscles hurt, when the joints ache, when there is pain, we would rather rest than go and drill. So Paul is saying to you and I, this is what life is all about. You and I, we have to train ourselves. We have to train our body, soul, and spirit like an athlete. We have to be disciplined. That when difficulties come our way, what Paul would say to you and I in our language is that we should train ourselves to do what it should do instead of what we want to do. Now, it's interesting about this idea that Paul is addressing here for us. I'm kind of reading between the lines here, and I think that Paul is implying the idea that this should be done before the race happens. Now, to put that in our language, what Paul would say to you and I is that you should train yourself to endure the challenges of life, to endure the difficulties of life before the difficulties of life come your way. Because that's what an athlete does, is that they train before game time. They train before performance time. Because if you just expect to show up to game time and act like a professional, things ain't going to go too good for you. Kind of like the Dodgers this year. Okay. They just slacked off a little bit in the end, and look where it got them. Okay. My name is Brian. I like to have some fun. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that Paul says that all of these things are like shadow boxing. When we don't want to go to practice, when we don't want to discipline ourselves, he says, if you are running this race of life, all you're doing is just beating the air if you're not going to be intentional about what life is about. So we should focus our attention on training ourselves to do what it should so that we can win every time. You know, recently I heard a quote from a professional athlete, and I just thought this was so, I can't remember who it was. I think it was a Dodger, which is interesting, okay? But here's what they said. They said, you know, amateurs practice until they get it right. But professionals practice until they can't get it wrong. You see the difference? There's a big difference there, isn't that? Which raises an interesting question, because when it comes to life, when it comes to your life, when it comes to raising your kids, when it comes to your marriage, when it comes to how you respond to situations on your job, or even financial decisions or life altering decisions, these things in life that come your way, your faith, your future, when it comes to all of that stuff that you can think about, here's the question I think it is imperative for you and I to answer today. And that is this: are you okay with just getting it right occasionally? Or do you want to train yourself so that you can't ever get it wrong? You see the difference? Because when it comes to your life, when it comes to your faith, when it comes to your family, when it comes to your future, when it comes to that moment when you stand in front of your Lord Savior, Jesus Christ, okay, you only get one race to run. You only get one chance to win. You can't go back and re-raise your kids. You can't go back and treat your spouse differently. You can't go back and erase the things that you wish that you had never done, because when you stand before God on the end of your life, and you can't just say to him, you know, God, yeah, I'm seeing now that some things, you know, I kind of did some things wrong, and can you give me another chance? Because it's done. Your chances are over. Because when you cross that finish line, it's finished. And how you and I train ourselves today determines how strong you finish in the end.